Welcome to the War Room. It's Tuesday, June the 30th, the year of our Lord 2020. You're in the War Room. Greg Manns, Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam, Stephen K. Bannon joining us down the line on America's Voice.News, later on in Newsmax TV, on the John Fredericks Radio Network, FM 99.1 and 103.9 in Chicago, and blown through the CCP's firewall in China, subtitled in Mandarin, thanks to G News and GTV. We're very grateful for all of our partners and grateful for you guys out there sharing everything you see. It means the world to us and it makes the world of difference. We are just, I guess, Steve, about 60 days away from the first ballots being cast, and you're starting to see this convergence of narratives here in the United States as this election begins to play out in earnest. Steve.
Yeah, I don't think people really realize that November 3rd is going to be election day throughout the country, where people go to vote in person. But mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, all this is going on right now. A lot of it's still uncertain. Some of the voting, I know it starts at least by October 1st, particularly in states like Colorado and others. But I believe, Raheem, we may even be into September. So we're coming down to the home stretch here, and you can see what's going on. I mean, Raheem, let's go through. I want to talk about your construct that's happening both on the media side, the information warfare side, and also the tech warfare side, which is part of information warfare. I mean, they're coming at the president right now with converging forces, and you see this on CNN about this thing with Bernstein. You see it with in Afghanistan with this Afghanistan leak. So, Raheem, why don't we walk people through your construct and how they're supposed to think about this? Remember, we don't try to chase just the basic news stories every day. We try to give you the signal, not the noise. There's a lot going on here, and it's going on a global basis. Some time this morning to walk the audience through it.
You know, Steve, I was suspended off Twitter for the last week. And when something like that happens to you, because you tend to be consumed by your notifications and what's going on and trying to follow the news streams and every single little bit of breaking information, every single meme that comes out, every single video that's out there. And having been off it for a week, you realize just how much of the noise you're getting caught up in and how much of the day you're getting caught up in just listening to the noise and consuming the noise and regurgitating the noise. And actually it gives you a better chance to hone down on the signal. And the signal is this right now. Whether it's the pandemic, whether it's national security, whether it's big tech, whether it's foreign affairs, all of that you're seeing right now, layer upon layer, the chipping away at the credibility of this president. I think it's fair to say, and I have it in my hand here for the people watching on the live stream, that this Carl Bernstein piece that ran in CNN yesterday, I mean, absolutely gargantuan piece. I think it must be 6 pages long when printed back in front. This gives you the playbook right here. This is you. If you look at my highlights on this thing, I might even scan this in, Steve, and put this up on the War Room site. But if you look at this and you just go through the first couple of pages, Vladimir Putin, Recep Erdogan, McMaster, Bolton, Mattis, Tillerson, Kelly, Theresa May, Angela Merkel, Mohammed bin Salman, Kim Jong-un, that's only after the first 150 words into the article, Steve. So you've gone through this. You've seen what Carl Bernstein had to say. We have a clip as well that we can play from last night whenever you're ready for it, Steve. But what is it actually telling us about this strategy?
Let's play Bernstein's piece, because this is very important for the audience to understand. This also links into this Afghanistan fracas that's out there. So let's listen to what Bernstein has to say, and then let's go through this kind of line by line.
I think we have.
You believe that the president was never told anything about this threat by anybody?
Well, I'm certain that's true. I mean, they've been very clear. Director Radcliffe, the CIA, the president, the vice president, Robert O'Brien, the NSA, everyone around him has been very clear that they did not brief this to the president or the vice president.
I think we have a production issue there with AVN. We're working on getting that Bernstein clip up instead.
Raheem, let's just go on.
I think we have it, Steve. Steve, I think we have it.
Let's do it.
Steve, I think we have it.
Okay.
Should we roll? Can we roll Carl Bernstein?
One of the sources said Trump gave away the store to Erdogan in Syria. He allowed American troops, as both Putin and Erdogan wanted, to withdraw he ordered the withdrawal of American troops from Syria, and the result was that the Kurds, our allies, were open for slaughter. And that's what Erdogan wanted. And he had a willing partnership in it with Donald Trump. But the real thing about these calls is that they show that the president's closest national security aides, his Secretary of Defense, his Chief of Staff, his Secretary of State, all came to the conclusion that in these calls especially, they showed that the President of the United States, through being incompetent and being a bully and beating up on allies, calling them all kinds of names in these phone calls, that he himself, Trump, is a danger to the national security. That is an extraordinary thing, unique in our history.
Steve, you heard it there. That's Carl Bernstein.
Okay, this is total and complete nonsense. What Bernstein misses and what the conventional wisdom, remember, Bernstein is part of this Washington consensus that is the managed decline of the United States. And you're seeing it every day on the streets of the United States, and you've seen it internationally, where we spent $7, $8, $9, $10 trillion, not just in the Middle East, but on other people's security, right? To make the world less secure. The Washington establishment, the Washington consensus, and you normally see it on Morning Joe every morning with guys like Richard Haas and David Ignatius and Admiral Stavridis, and now you got Carl Bernstein, who knows almost nothing about national security, except the fact he wrote an awful biography of Pope John Paul. You've got him weighing in here. He misses the key point, as a guy like Carl Bernstein almost always does. In America First national security policy, it was to make sure in those key geopolitical areas of the world, Western Europe, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and up in the Northwest Pacific, in the East China Sea with Korea and Japan, that the Allies were very focused on exactly what was going on, particularly China's efforts to consolidate the Eurasian landmass with their allies, Pakistan, Iran, and now, unfortunately, Russia. And it was President Trump. The reason these calls were tough, and the reason sometimes that people like Mattis and General Kelly and Tillerson had a problem with is President Trump was elected to have a very different national security policy. America first. It doesn't mean America isolationist. It means America more engaged in the world probably than ever. But where our allies are picking up their burden both in cost, in troops, and really in focus. And so he goes through this litany of issues like in Syria. Syria's been a bone of contention from day one. I was the one that argued against people like Mattis and Kelly and McMaster's and others that want to go in and do a missile launch into Syria, which hindsight proves was wrong. Once again, Stephen K. Bannon was right. Mattis, McMaster's, Tillerson, Kelly were all wrong about that missile strike, which was ridiculous. All they wanted to do was get in a further engagement into Syria. This is the old Atlanticist Cold War mentality. And they never focused on the existential threat to this country, the Chinese Communist Party.
And Steve,
and to go through these calls, particularly, let's take Merkel for an example. The Merkel calls were very tough. Why? Germany's not paying its weight. I think Germany's total defense bill at the time was like $35 billion. We did a interim budget increase of like $35 billion, as much as Germany has in its entire national security. Germany is simply a deadbeat of paying for their national security. And for years, and all the European papers reported this. You remember this, Raheem?
Yep.
One of the reasons that there's consternation in NATO was the European countries are going to eventually have to start paying for more of their defense, and particularly things like equipment, training, interoperability, the things that make an alliance strong. And that's when President Trump was on there, and he wasn't bullying Prime Minister May. He was giving, I think, Prime Minister May some very good guidance on Brexit. And I never saw that, as he said, he wilted. I thought it was very sexist the way that he wrote it. I thought Prime Minister May, who wasn't exactly my cup of tea, but I thought she did fine. She had her own ideas. She had her own opinions. She didn't totally agree with Donald J. Trump. That's fine. And I think what Bernstein wrote was very sexist about her. And Merkel had her own, own ideas, and she didn't really back down. They had a bunch of lame excuses for why they weren't really paying for the defense. At the same time, becoming Russia's #1 business partner, becoming the biggest taking the biggest outtake of the natural gas deal. And so, yeah, there were very controversial and very tough discussions, but the president was realigning American national security policy into something that guarantees peace and prosperity. And think about it. All these warmongers, all these guys want to go into kinetic war, okay? Donald Trump understood information warfare and he understood economic warfare. It was above as much respect I have for General Mattis and General Kelly. They didn't get it. McMaster is a whole different thing. He's a total and complete disaster. And he's a liar when he comes out and says anything about China. He fought us on China every step of the way. Don't ask me. Go in and ask Peter Navarro. Ask Mike Pompeo. Ask the Hawks. Okay? So President Trump was changing American national security policy, and look at the results. The results is that we're stronger, we're safer, and the world's actually, before the CCP virus was becoming more prosperous. So, Raheem, I know you know the European part of this, but this Bernstein thing is just a bunch of lies and leaks from the, and I don't want to call it the deep state, it's the in-your-face state.
Steve, it's in your face. It's in the first 150 words of this Bernstein piece. I don't want to calling it shooting their shot, but this outlines exactly where the strategy on national security, i.e., as you Americans know it, that 3 a.m. phone call, where that narrative is going. And interestingly, Steve, we've got about 2 minutes in this segment here. I want to get to exactly what you just said. You mentioned Theresa May, you mentioned Angela Merkel, and the piece talks at length about the distinction between President Trump's phone calls with dictators and phone calls with allies. But the point that is, if you read between the lines, and again, I think I'm going to put this up on the site with my notations on it, when you read between the lines, Steve, what you're actually seeing is a U.S. president who wants strong allies, not dependents, not protectorates. And you can look at how Prime Minister May is described, as you said, in a very sexist way by Carl Bernstein, says that President Trump would say humiliating and bullying things to her. And then in the very next paragraph, Steve, he says Prime Minister May became flustered and nervous in her conversations. Well, if that's a world leader addressing another world leader and she's becoming flustered and nervous, then the charge of weakness stands as far as I'm concerned. And Theresa May isn't Prime Minister anymore for that very same reason. But we've got about 1 minute. I want to get back to you on this. The convergence of these narratives here.
Yeah, by the way, you got to do. You have to do the annotated notes on this thing. It's very important, and we can get into a little bit of this in the next segment too. But you're right. The concept is allies are not protectorates. We're not looking for protectors, looking for allies. And President Trump, you see from his actions, stood up to all the dictators, including Xi, including Putin, including the mullahs. Just look at the actions. Okay, these conversations, and with May, she had different opinion. I never saw her wilting. I never saw her. I think Carl Bernstein here has been incredibly sexist. I didn't agree with Prime Minister May on a lot of stuff. But remember, she's the prime minister. She had her own house style. And this wasn't anything she was kowtowing to Donald Trump. And President Trump wouldn't speak to her like that.
Steve,
he has respect for the office of prime minister.
They're going to do this not just with national security. They're going to do this layer upon layer, taking the president down with the pandemic, by big tech. We're going to get into it after the break. Dave Ramaswamy, Stephen K. Bannon, Jack Maxey, Greg Mans, Raheem Kassam. Don't go away.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Okay, welcome back to the War Room. Greg Mans, Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam here on Capitol Hill. Stephen K. Bannon and Dave Ramaswamy join us down the line. Steve, just to tidy this up from the last segment, because it's very important people recognize what's going on here. Amongst all of the noise that's going on out there, whether it's Antifa in the streets, whether it's Black Lives Matter, all of this, what you have right now is a convergence of not the deep state, the in-your-face state. The names in the first 150 words words of the Carl Bernstein CNN story. And it's the exact same thing, the parallel track to what we're seeing about this story in Afghanistan. This Taliban or Taliban-linked militias who supposedly had bounties on U.S. soldiers from the Russians, allegedly, and that the president supposedly was doing nothing about it. Steve?
Yeah, we're about to be hit. This is the great thing about being at sea. Sometimes we're overexposed because of sunlight. Other times we've got a rain squall coming in, so I may have to bounce here in a second. But no, this Afghanistan leak is exactly the same story as the Carl Bernstein. This is the national security apparatus just leaking on President Trump. It's total nonsense. Dave Ramaswamy is going to talk in a second about things happening in Pakistan, but this is just the national security apparatus. And people have to understand, and I think people in the White House understand, this is going to happen every day, every other day from now to Election Day. They're just going to be leaking these kind of insane stories about President Trump. So just get ready for it. And I think somebody's got to combat it. We're going to do it by just stating the truth. The Bernstein story is nonsense. It's written in a very immature way with a guy that really doesn't understand geopolitics and certainly doesn't understand American national security. And this Afghanistan thing is just another aspect of it. I know we got a big section on tech, and we got Dave Ramaswamy. So I think I'm going to wrap up here for a second, guys, and we'll see you in the next segment.
Thank you, Stephen K. Bannon. Obviously, you can't get that hair wet. You know, that would be a whole 3 or 4 hours in the hair salon figuring it out. Steve, we'll take it from here. Just ping us when you're back. Greg, I want to know how many words long this Carl Bernstein piece in CNN is, because it is an extraordinary insight into the mind of the establishment here and where we're going into. If you, ladies and gentlemen at home, if you want to understand the battlefield for the next couple of months ahead of you, really for the next 60 days ahead of you, because some people will be voting very soon, much sooner than ever before, much sooner than people think. Why do you think the narratives are being dropped now? Why do you think the construct is being laid out now? Because of the early mail-in voting. They want to convince you, Carl Bernstein wants to convince you, that re-electing President Trump is a threat to national security. That's the clear signal from this story, and you have to read this story line by line. Connect the dots, connect the names. Look at the quotes that are being used. Look at how they're being used. Look at the placement of the quotes. Look at how they structure their words very carefully. You know, CNN yesterday reports a source, a single source, which, by the way, a single source on a story like this is as far as I'm concerned, journalistic malpractice. But they quote a single, unnamed junior source. How do I know it's junior? Because if CNN has high-level sources, they're the first to crow about it. So they quote a source. They don't say it's a high-level source. They say a source with familiarity with the latest developments. That could be somebody in the copy room, as far as I'm concerned. Familiarity with the latest developments. I got familiarity with the latest developments. You guys have familiarity with the latest development. It's the way the words are used. It's the way the phrases are couched that gives away the game. You have to go through this. The other thing that happens on the same day, in the same moment, this is Axios in front of me. If you're not reading it, you must read the opposition party media day on day. Axios. Tech finally begins a crackdown on Trump. Tech finally begins a crackdown on Trump. That's Axios, by the way, giving away in its headline the fact that it believes that the President of the United States should be cracked down upon by big tech. It's no surprise, of course, that the Axioses and the Politicos of the world are sponsored by big tech companies, big hedge funds, all of that. You just go through their newsletters. You can see who sponsors them, who advertises with them, who's attracted to their events. You look through this thing, Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, and even heckles the president directly, calls his executive order against social media platforms toothless. Toothless. That's in his face. It's in the White House's face. And when we get Stephen K. Bannon back as well, I know one of the things we want to talk about is the daily White House response to all of this. Do we have Steve? Yes. Steve?
Yeah, I think I'm back, and I dried my hair off for you, Raheem.
Steve, the daily White House response to all of this.
Well, listen, look, the White House has got a solid team. The campaign's got a solid team. I just think guys got to start punching back. Now, understanding, and I think you brought up the buried lead. Mike Allen, who I think is a great guy and a terrific journalist, he ought to be ashamed of himself. Finally cracks down. The implication is that Trump is always coming out with hate speech, right?
Right.
That he should be censored. The president of the United States should be censored. And I think it's outrageous. This tech piece is going to be a massive part. Remember, there were guys that were coming to us a year ago saying, hey, the right is already, through artificial intelligence, that Google and Facebook are already taking down a lot of the Trump supporters. And now you're seeing it as just as blatant as it could possibly be. But I think what we see in India, Prime Minister Modi has acted dramatically. And if we get Dave Ramaswamy, I want to make sure we get him in here and say exactly what's going on. And quite frankly, I think the way that this country should be taking on the Chinese Communist Party, particularly what they're trying to do in big tech.
Dave, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. I want to bring you in on this conversation now. Let's just talk for a second about that Taliban story, because this is what started off this onslaught of national security, quote-unquote, reporting that we've seen. Tell us from your perspective a little bit more of what you're hearing about these supposed bounties that President Trump didn't do anything about.
Thank you, Raheem. Always a pleasure to be on the show. One thing I have to say is, remember that Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan and was given a hiding place there by Pakistani army and intelligence for 10 years. So 10 years after 9/11, he was taken out by a Navy SEAL team in 2011. So they aided and comforted him. And then last week in the Pakistani parliament, Imran Khan, the prime minister, termed Osama bin Laden a martyr. Okay, so the backstory is Pakistani intelligence and the army rogue forces have been giving aid and solace to the Taliban. They have been responsible for the killing and maiming of thousands of U.S. soldiers. So if anyone has a bounty on U.S. soldiers, it's been the Pakistani army and the Taliban.
And Dave, just how long has this been going on for? Because the reporting contemporaneously would suggest that this is something very new, something that's only happened under President Trump, and something that therefore only President Trump can be held to account for, allegedly ignoring this.
I think it's been going on for a long time. And so accusing President Trump of somehow being personally responsible for this is just duplicitous, and it's a distraction. And I know President Trump also wanted to draw down forces in Afghanistan, so I think there's some special interests that don't want that to happen, and so they're creating this new story, somehow deeming him irresponsible or reckless again.
To attempt,
I mean, and he's not. In fact, President Trump has taken steps to withdraw funding to Pakistan and withdraw funding to the forces inimical to America's national security, and so his moves on that front have been absolutely spot on.
Yeah, Dave, in an attempt to bounce
Raheem,
the president into a new conflict. Go ahead, Steve.
Raheem, let me jump in here. Let me jump in here for a second. This is very important because this gets down to the heart of it. Why is that story not leaked into the New York Times? And here's why. Because the national security apparatus has made a bet on Pakistan for decades. It's part of the reason we've pissed all that money away in the Middle East. And we sit there and kowtow to them, to the ISI, to be our friend, to help us in Afghanistan, to help us in the Middle East. And clearly, they are an ally of the Chinese Communist Party, just like the mullahs in Iran. And the national security apparatus doesn't want to admit this. That's why you don't see any leaks about that. That's why it's got to be about Afghanistan. This is, and what Ramaswamy says is absolutely brilliantly true. And this is the kind of pushback I think we need to seeing out of the White House and out of the existing Defense Department, the intelligence agencies, and Secretary Pompeo. The cards got to be laid on the table, okay? Pakistan is not an ally to the United States. They're an ally to the Chinese Communist Party. And they've been playing this for a long time. And why the New York Times doesn't get this information leaked to them that, hey, the bounties are really coming from the guys in Pakistan, right? And I don't know about the Russia situation or the details of it, but it looks like it was just raw intelligence and did not rise to the level that it should be presented. just another kind of story out there. But it was leaked, it was weaponized and given to the New York Times. You'll never see that about Pakistan.
And Dave, we've got about a minute left in this segment. I just want you to come back on that if there's anything remaining on that, but also then tee us up for the next segment. We want you to hold over and tee us up for the next segment on how the Indian government, Prime Minister Modi, breaking bad against big tech, because over here, the news outlets like Axios, they are celebrating. Tech finally begins a crackdown on Trump, but India is finally beginning a tech crackdown on the CCP. Is that not right?
Raheem, let me just finish by saying the U.S. allying with Pakistan to fight terror was like someone allying with call girls to fight promiscuity. I mean, it was the most absurd policy, and President Trump put an end to it. Like, moving on to India,
Dave, hold that thought.
Moved by Prime Minister Modi.
Dave, hold that thought. We've got to jump to a quick break. Please stick around. We've got to get into all of this. We've got the time. Here in the War Room, Greg Manns, Jack Maxey, Jack with more pandemic details and data. Don't miss that. Stephen K. Bannon down the line. We'll be back in just a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
On America's Voice.News, Newsmax TV, the John Fredericks Radio Network, FM 99.1 and 103.9, and G News and GTV blown through the firewalls. This is War Room Pandemic, live from Capitol Hill. Over to Stephen K. Bannon.
Look, from the border of India and China to the South China Sea, the streets of Hong Kong, the Chad, or Chaz in Seattle, to the nation's capital. You know, we cover the global turbulence every day on the show. We pride ourselves in getting to the signal, not the noise. And if you are an entrepreneur, you know you're going to be the lead to turn this around, not just in this country, but the world. If you're an entrepreneur, you need NetSuite by Oracle. That's netsuite.com/Bannon, Bannon. Go get your report on the 7 action steps that entrepreneurs should be taking now. NetSuite by Oracle. Oracle is number 1 in the cloud. NetSuite's number 1 with entrepreneurs. Raheem, this is pretty amazing about this tech shutdown of the president, or the tech monitoring of the president. But I'm very proud that we're Modi fans. I'm very proud that we've been in back of President Modi since the old Breitbart days back in 2013 and 2014. And it was so great to meet Dave Ramaswamy and Jay Kansara and all the people, the Hindu American Society, all the people that helped make Howdy Modi the biggest event President Trump's ever had in the United States, and then that huge rally over in India. But President Modi, I tell you what, he does not mess around. Dave, tell us what he did yesterday to basically punch out the Chinese Communist Party as it goes to big tech.
Thank you, Steve. Yesterday, India took one of the most dramatic moves taken by any democracy against the CCP, which is it mandated the uninstalling of about 60 Chinese apps, including TikTok, UC News, which is a browser, and some other apps for photo sharing. And let me tell you why that's a baller move. What the CCP has been trying to do in India and other democratic countries is trying to subvert the constitutional validity and democratic norms that exist in these countries. To use and if you see, Steve, what's happening with the rallies in America, TikTok was used to run interference operation against President Trump's rally in Oklahoma, and it's also been used as a tool to gather up rioters and looters. So, I mean, and a similar occurrence happened in India right before President Trump went there in February. So with this move, Prime Minister Modi is sending a strong signal to the CCP that the foreign interference in India's economy is not going to be tolerated anymore. And also remember, last week, like Indian Army soldiers at the India-Tibet border who were outnumbered by China 5-1, still inflicted 2 times as many casualties on the Chinese. So this is like a 1-2 punch to the CCP.
Dave, it's a...
Hey, Raheem, I want to ask Dave a question.
Go ahead, Steve.
I want to ask just Dave a question about to parents out there. It's very controversial about TikTok. What is Prime Minister Modi actually saying? Be very specific. What is he telling Indian parents about TikTok? Because, you know, TikTok is really a cultural phenomenon with young people. So, Dave Ramaswamy, what is Prime Minister Modi telling people, and particularly parents in the United States of America, how should they think about TikTok and the use of TikTok by their teenage kids?
Steve, I know 9 out of 10 dancing nurses prefer TikTok, but that being said, I think the message Prime Minister Modi is trying to send is national security trumps anything else. Individual preferences, individual needs, and so the message is just like our soldiers at the border and soldiers around the world sacrifice their lives, sacrifice their time to fight an enemy, all of us citizens of any democratic country who cares about freedom and liberty needs to sacrifice and put our personal preferences aside to stand on the same side of our soldiers and country.
Hey, Raheem, let's pivot now. We've got Dave on. I want to pivot. He's our mathematician. I want to pivot to you and Jack, and I want to talk about the CCP virus in this pandemic and what's going on, particularly with the math. People, I think, are losing the plot here. This is what the story is. The Chinese Communist Party, whether they created in a biological weapons lab or whether it was in a P4 lab they were doing research on, particularly gain-of-function research, and you saw this, the dangers of that in the great film documentary done by Simone Gao the other day. The Chinese Communist Party owns the chain of title of hiding this virus from the world. And we know from Southampton University, if they had been upfront and told the world in December 2019 what was going on, 95% of the deaths, 95% of the economic carnage would have been avoided. This is the responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party. I think it's incumbent upon President Trump and our government to start to hammer that home every single day. Because I don't even want to think about the second wave. We're still in the middle of the first wave. So, Jack, why don't you and Dave Ramaswamy take us through a couple things? The exponential growth of this, right? Number one, also what we call targeted interventions. What can be done to kind of stop the spread of this thing, particularly to high risk groups? So, Jack and Dave, why don't you jump in here?
Well, Dave, you want me to jump in first here? I'll just start about the issues that are before us. I think there's been a great controversy about what we see as these exploding cases across the country. Now, even the CDC is saying that most of these cases seem to be amongst young people who often are asymptomatic. And this is, again, a really big issue when it comes to how do we track asymptomatic carriers. I mean, even Fauci on CNN the other day said that one of the great problems with these asymptomatic is, first of all, you don't know he's sick, and then how do you contact trace people for him? So that becomes a real issue. And there's been a lot of talk today about some things that Ann Schuchat had said on an interview, a podcast interview with JAMA yesterday. It was the Heart of an Axios article this morning where she is quoted as saying this is really the beginning of this pandemic, and that's the quotation that they pull out. But actually, she said quite a few other things in there, which I think show you the level of...
Hey, Jack.
Yes, sir.
Jack, hang on for a second. Why is she important? Give her title. This is important because she's a senior member of the Trump government. This is why it's so important. It's why Axios highlights it. And what she said, I thought was pretty explosive, if that's the only thing you saw.
Right, and she's the principal deputy director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She's had well over a 30-year career in the organization. She should be an absolute pandemic expert. Now, when she said this is really the beginning, and that's what's been pulled out by everybody, and had a long conversation, and I'll post this podcast on my Twitter feed and on our Twitter feed. It's about 35 minutes long. I watched it early this morning to try and get more background. It's actually kind of a fascinating study, and she's talking about how do we get control of this, and she says a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. He said, well, we get so much different information from you guys, and she said, listen, because we are learning so much every day, the data can be very confusing, and much of it, she said, let's be real, has been contradictory over time. So one thing that we've tried to always say on this show, and it's something that I think that we still have to remember, this is the end of June right now. The very first case we had here was only 4 months ago. So the learning curve on this has been dramatic in terms of modern science. She also says some things that I thought were quite interesting. He asks her questions about the face shields and maybe why shouldn't people wear a plastic mask over top of their masks. And she said, well, we really don't have any good data to prove that will help. And then he says, well, why would you use that in a hospital setting? She says, well, because in a hospital setting, we're just doing as much as we possibly can. But for normal people, that's probably not that important. Now, the thing that I thought was very, very important in this, and it comes down to whether or not we need to open up, and she echoes something that Fauci had said the other day, which I think is quite surprising for most people, which is this notion that they really do not have any understanding as to how long these antibodies will last, how long they will be effective. She said at one point that there's some evidence that people with mild infections may not even create adequate antibodies. So, she said we're looking around the world, and even in countries where they've had massive infection rates, like Sweden, where they kind of let it run and theoretically should have one of the highest levels of infection in Europe, she said we're nowhere near the level necessary for herd immunity. And then she said, with this disease, unlike with an influenza, we may have to start recalibrating what we think of as herd immunity.
What does that mean?
I.e., if you don't necessarily retain the antibodies for great lengths of time, or if you don't necessarily...
So this could just potentially be a comeback thing every year.
Right, and there's some indication about the idea of...
Hold it. Raheem, to be brutally frank, is what they're saying is that this virus, you may not even... The concept of herd immunity, which Sweden and others in England went after, may not actually be relevant here.
Right.
You may not even be able to have herd immunity. That's how complicated this thing is.
Well,
right, Jack, is that not the?
This is true, and there's some evidence that sort of supports her, querying about this idea. In that, last week in the Oxford vaccine study, they found that people who got double dosages of the vaccine had much greater amount of antibodies. So it may just be that the vaccine needs to be at a higher level to create the antibodies. But it's very, very confusing. Now, what she also said, which I thought was interesting, Steve, you remember about 6 weeks ago we brought up the study in Arizona that was looking at the genetic decay of the SARS-2 virus, the CCP virus, and comparing it to the genetic decay of the original SARS virus from 2003. And they noticed that some segments that were similar to the ones that were dropping out of the original SARS were dropping out of this one. So there was speculation as to whether or not this virus was decaying in a way that would mean that it was less lethal, which is what actually they believe happened to SARS-1. Now, what she said, which I thought was really interesting, she said there is a definite genetic difference between the West Coast version of the virus that's hitting, say, Southern California and the Southwest, and the virus that hit New York City. And we see this little difference perhaps in the lethality of it in a broad subject matter. So, as always, this is an absolutely moving target, and if we want to go into the testing versus the number of cases, that's an extraordinary topic that we can run through here pretty quickly too. But
well, I'd like to. We got to get into Hong Kong in the next segment, but I want to go Dave Ramaswamy. I don't know how much time we have, but Steve, what about the math? When you look at this math, Dave, is this exponential growth?
Dave, hold that thought. We'll come back from the break. and talk about that. We'll talk about the cases versus the death rate as well. A lot of people out there still concerned with what's going on in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their hospitals. We'll get an update on that from Jack as well. A whole lot more to cover, Hong Kong and otherwise, here on War Room Pandemic. Greg Mans, Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam here on Capitol Hill. Stephen K. Bannon, Dave Ramaswamy joining us down the line. Make sure you're tuned in to hashtag War Room Pandemic on Parler as well as on Twitter. We want to hear your feedback. We'll be back in a second.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Whether it's national security or big tech or the pandemic, we've got you covered here in the War Room as we draw closer and closer to the election here in the United States, just about 60 days away from the first votes being cast with all the mail-in ballots and absentee voting going on. I want to throw it over to Stephen K. Bannon.
Think about that for a second. We got 60 days when they start voting in the 2020 election. Pretty extraordinary. These are turbulent times. Now, we cover the geopolitics of it every day. We cover the economic inferno, what's happening in the capital markets, this explosion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, all of that. And if you're an investor, and particularly if you're planning for your retirement or if you're already in retirement, it's now time you at least have to think about adding precious metals to your portfolio. Birch Gold is the top company in this space. We're proud to have them as a sponsor. Go to birchgold.com/Bannon, Bannon. They've got a 20-page analysis that you should go through and start to consider precious metals. Remember, they can either have it that you can own it and hold it, or you can put it in your IRA. They've got all different types of alternatives. Birch Gold, it's time that you started to think about adding precious metals to your stock and bond portfolio. Raheem, nothing could be crazier in these times, and particularly when it comes to this pandemic. Dave, walk us just through the math. You were the guy that said, hey, one of the biggest shortcomings with humanity is people don't understand math or math illiterate, and they don't understand the exponential function. As you look at these numbers that Jack and the team wrestle with every day, do you see real exponential growth in these cases, or is this a case where the media is just reporting increased testing?
Steve, I think we are firmly in the exponential decline phase. I know there are some states which have reported increase in cases, and guess what? I mean, what happened 2 weeks ago that would lead people to believe that cases would explode? Shouting, yelling in the streets, hello, anybody? So I think what you've seen now is institutional, like I would say, hypocrisy. At one level, they want to shut people down, and at the other level, they want to encourage events where people shout in each other's faces, what I call super spreading events, increasing the probability to get an infection. But overall, to your question, this pandemic, at least for this year, I think it's over for much of the country. You're going to still see some cases pop up here and there. But once again, as we discussed back in February and March, the only reason to put a hard lockdown was to prevent the hospitals from getting flooded and to catch up on the PPEs. So I think the U.S. has done a great job on catching up. And of course, in the next phase, the advice still should be take reasonable precaution, wear masks in closed closed indoor spaces. I mean, don't attend all day long conferences and just take reasonable precautions. But there's no reason to go through a very expensive lockdown of the economy, which has very negative second order effects, like higher domestic abuse, higher child abuse, the deaths from suicide, deaths of despair. So I think now it's the time to balance things.
One other thing, David, it's Jack Maxey.
I want to go.
Oh, sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing, Jack, before we come back to, this is the CCP virus is incredibly insidious, and General Spaulding's going to join us in the next section to talk about this. But that's why people are not focused on what the responsibility is and who's should be accountable for this. Jack, I know you're going to take us through a different analysis right now, but this entire thing has been caused by the Chinese Communist Party. And no one in Washington, D.C. is really stepping up and saying, hey, they're responsible, they're accountable. It's the reason it's got all these different types of permutations. One of the reasons they wanted to see Pompeo in Hawaii last week was to kind of complain about how there's a lot of hot talking coming out of shows like ours, right? Well, it's time for them now to open up about every P3 and P4 lab. We have to get all information, because we're not going to solve the situation, Jack, as you know, until we actually find the origin of this, we find the original genetic structure of it, and the Chinese Communist Party stops messing around. We need a combination of nations. The WHO is so owned by the CCP, they're not going to be any help. But we need a combination of nations to sit down with the CCP and say, hey, we need full disclosure immediately of everything in these P3 and P4 labs, and particularly about this virus. Now, Jack, I know you've got some other incidences around the country you want to talk about.
Well, what I wanted to talk about, we used the magic 8-ball of the University of Washington study to define future deaths, et cetera. That seems to be the format that is used by the CDC and everyone. Now, what was quite interesting is overnight, they dropped the estimations for deaths by October 1 by nearly 5,000 people. And there's been no explanation of why that's dropped. And it's a bit odd because we're hearing this kind of panicked message from the media. We went over how they were saying that the hospitals in Houston were going to be overwhelmed. The Methodist hospital system down there, largest one in the country. And what was so interesting, and we're seeing this with the way they calculate number of cases, et cetera, individual hospital systems, individual states, counties can just change their criteria overnight, and it changes the outcome. So in Houston, what had happened was they changed the way they were calculating their ICU beds. For the entire pandemic, they were calculating them at a rate that said they had 72% full. And then just last week, for no stated reason, they say that they were just confused. They turned it into that they only had 90, that they were at 94% capacity. Now they've pulled it back. But in that process, you watched the whole media of the world go bananas, and you actually had a judge in Harris County in Houston impose more of the lockdown based upon this bad data. So I want to read to people something that is on the CDC site, and I know we've got only a few, maybe a minute left. But if you look at the CDC site, you look at testing data in the U.S., right off the top, they say about the data. The data are compiled from a number of sources. Not all tests are even reported to the CDC. The number of positive tests in a state is not equal to the number of cases, as one person may be tested more than once. So you begin to see how trying to dig through this is kind of a Rubik's Cube, and the Washington Post even now is posting a kind of disclaimer about the data because it's so hard to dig through.
Okay, we got to bounce. Dave Ramaswamy, thank you so much for joining us. Stephen K. Bannon in the next hour. General Spaulding joins us about the war for your mind and how we've ended up in this scenario, in this position right now. War and Pandemic episode 258 begins in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.